At 19 years of age, Elara Vance stood upon the mud-slicked banks of Oakhaven Bend with nothing to her name but a bruised spirit and the cold weight of a single gold eagle coin. Her uncle, Silas Thorne, a man whose heart had been replaced by the dry ink of ledgers and the sharp hunger of property deeds, had cast her out of the family's timber mill, claiming her father's sudden passing left behind debts that only Elara's destitution could satisfy. With that final $10, she did what the town called a fool's errand. She purchased the Gilded Willow, a rusted, half-sunken houseboat that had been rotting in the reeds for a generation, a ghost of a vessel that the current threatened to pull into the depths of the Missouri at any moment. To the eyes of the onlookers, she was merely a girl clinging to a drowning dream, a desperate soul buying a coffin made of iron and silt. Yet, within that barnacle-crusted hull, behind a bulkhead that the river had spared and the light had forgotten, lay a secret cabin that held the power to not only rewrite the stars of her own life but to mend the broken foundations of the entire valley. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Elara Vance. If you are watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments. The Missouri River in the year 1888 was a creature of constant, restless movement, a great brown artery that carried the hopes of the frontier upon its churning back. We remember how the town of Oakhaven Bend seemed to cling to the high bluffs for safety, its wooden skeletons reaching toward the sky while its feet remained forever buried in the alluvial silt. It was here that Elara had been raised, not in the fine parlors of the town's rising merchant class, but in the rhythmic, sawdust-scented world of the Vance timber mill. Her father, Benjamin, was a man who spoke to wood as if it were a living confidant. He taught her that every plank had a memory and every grain told the story of the seasons it had endured. From the time she could carry a bucket of grease, Elara was his shadow, learning the intricate dance of the great water wheel and the precise tension required to keep the massive saws singing through heartwood. Benjamin did not just teach her the mechanics of industry, he taught her the quiet dignity of preservation. He would tell us that a man who respects the tool will never be betrayed by the work. They lived in a modest house of cedar and stone, where the sound of the river was their nightly lullaby, and the smell of fresh pine was the perfume of their prosperity. Elara grew tall and lean, her hands toughened by the rasp of bark and the turn of wrenches, possessing a mind that could see the hidden logic in a pile of rusted gears. She understood that value was rarely found on the surface of things, it was earned through the patient unmasking of potential. Her father often spoke of the river as a ledger of history, claiming that whatever the water took, it eventually paid back in different coin. This belief in a just and circular world became the anchor of Elara's character, a silent promise that the effort poured into the earth would one day rise to meet the labor with a bountiful hand. She was a girl of the river, a child of the gears, and in those early years, the world felt as solid and reliable as the heartwood of a centuries-old oak. But the river is a fickle god, and the fortunes of men are often written in water. In the spring of her 19th year, a series of relentless storms turned the Missouri into a thundering wall of debris and fury. We watched as the banks dissolved like sugar, and the very ground beneath the Vance mill began to groan. Benjamin, ever the protector of his legacy, spent 3 days and nights in the freezing rain, trying to bolster the foundations and save the machinery that was his life's breath. The exertion and the damp seeped into his lungs, bringing a fever that no doctor in Oakhaven could break. Within a week, the saws fell silent, and the man who had been the town's steady heartbeat was gone. In the hollow silence that followed, Silas Thorne appeared like a vulture scenting the end. Silas was Benjamin's half-brother, a man of sharp angles and even sharper ambitions, who had long envied the mill and the land it sat upon. He arrived with a briefcase full of papers, claiming that Benjamin had used the mill as collateral for a series of disastrous investments in the failing rail lines. Elara, blinded by grief and unfamiliar with the predatory language of high-interest loans, found herself standing in a courtroom where the judge seemed to speak only to Silas. Within a month, the eviction notice was nailed to the cedar door. Silas took the mill, the house, and the horses, leaving Elara with nothing but a small trunk of her father's tools and the $10 he had tucked into her coat pocket on the day he died. She was cast out into a town that suddenly found it difficult to look her in the eye. In Oakhaven, as in much of the world, poverty is often mistaken for a contagious shadow. She spent her first nights in the hayloft of a sympathetic neighbor, but Silas's influence was long, and soon even that refuge was denied to her. He wanted her gone, a living reminder of his theft scrubbed from the streets of the Bend. By the end of the second week, she was sleeping beneath the eaves of the river wharf, her stomach a constant, gnawing ache, her only companion the gold eagle coin that she refused to spend on bread. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, as the mist clung to the water like a damp shroud, that Alara saw the sign posted at the harbormaster's shack. The gilded willow was to be sold for scrap. The boat had once been the pride of a wealthy surveyor who had vanished into the territory years ago, but now it was a tragic sight. It sat in a dead reach, a shallow stretch of reeds where the silt had claimed the hull, leaving the ironclad exterior to flake away in great orange scabs. The deck was warped, the windows were shattered, and the stench of stagnant water and old grease clung to it like a physical weight. To the townspeople, it was a nuisance, a hazard that the harbormaster wanted cleared before the summer floods. Silas Thorne had laughed when he saw the notice, remarking that the only thing the willow was good for was providing a home for the river rats. But Alara walked out into the mud, her boots sinking deep into the clay, and laid her hand upon the cold, rusted iron of the hull. We sensed it then, the way her fingers traced the lines of the metal, feeling for the structural integrity that others ignored. She went to the harbormaster and placed her $10 gold piece on the scarred wood of his desk. The man looked at the coin, then at the girl whose eyes held a fire that did not match her tattered skirts. He took the money, more out of pity than commerce, and handed her the heavy iron key that had hung on a rusted nail for a decade. "She's yours, Miss Vance," he said, his voice low, "though I fear I've just sold you a very expensive way to drown." Alara didn't answer. She took the key and walked back to the dead reach. That night, she moved her small trunk onto the tilting deck of the Willow. The first discovery happened within hours. As she used a crowbar to pry up the water-damaged floorboards in what had been the galley, she found that the boat was built with a double hull of thick, treated cypress, a material that did not rot and was nearly as strong as iron. This was not a cheap pleasure craft, it had been built to endure the most treacherous reaches of the river. And beneath the layer of silt and dead leaves in the corner of the aft cabin, she found a brass plate screwed into the bulkhead, bearing a set of coordinates and a single, cryptic phrase, "The truth flows beneath the mud." The first month on the Gilded Willow was a trial of bone and spirit that would have broken a lesser soul. Alara worked from the first light of dawn until the stars reflected in the dark water, her hands constantly stained with the red dust of iron rust and the gray grime of the river. She used her father's tools to rebuild the pumping mechanism, spending days waist-deep in the stagnant water of the bilge until she heard the glorious, rhythmic clatter of the valves clearing the hull. We watched her scavenge the riverbanks for discarded timber and scrap metal, her resourcefulness turning the town's refuse into the Willow's salvation. The townspeople of Oakhaven Bend began to gather on the bluffs, watching the mad miller's daughter as she slowly raised the boat from the mud. Silas Thorne would often ride his black horse to the edge of the cliff, his face a mask of cold amusement, confident that the first high tide would simply carry Alara and her rusted toy to the bottom of the Missouri. But Alara was not just cleaning, she was investigating. As the water receded from the interior, she began to notice architectural anomalies that made no sense for a simple houseboat. The central hallway was 6 inches narrower than the exterior dimensions suggested. There was a discrepancy in the weight of the aft section that even the silt could not account for. One evening, while scraping the heavy layers of lead paint from a mahogany cabinet in the master stateroom, she felt a slight give in the wood. It wasn't a drawer, but a panel, held in place by a sophisticated spring lock that had been jammed by a single pebble of river gravel. With a surgeon's precision, she cleared the obstruction and pushed. A section of the wall swung inward on silent, greased hinges, revealing a hidden cabin no larger than a walk-in pantry. It was a sanctuary of dry air and preserved history. Inside, she found a desk bolted to the floor, and upon it sat a series of leather-bound ledgers, a brass sextant, and a massive, hand-drawn map of the Oakhaven Valley. This was the hidden sanctum of Thomas Miller, the town's founder and the original surveyor of the territory. As Alara opened the first ledger, her breath hitched. It was not a diary of personal thoughts, but a meticulous record of every land grant, every mineral right, and every water use agreement made in the valley's history. And there, tucked between the pages of the 1870 volume, was a document that chilled her blood, a map of the Vance Timber Mill property, clearly showing that the common lands used by the town for grazing and river access were not owned by any individual, but were held in a perpetual trust for the people of Ovenhaven. The first month on the Gilded Willow was a trial of bone and spirit that would have broken a lesser soul. Elara worked from the first light of dawn until the stars reflected in the dark water, her hands constantly stained with the red dust of iron rust and the gray grime of the river. She used her father's tools to rebuild the pumping mechanism, spending days waist-deep in the stagnant water of the bilge until she heard the glorious, rhythmic clatter of the valves clearing the hull. We watched her scavenge the riverbanks for discarded timber and scrap metal, her resourcefulness turning the town's refuse into the Willow's salvation. The townspeople of Oakhaven Bend began to gather on the bluffs, watching the mad miller's daughter as she slowly raised the boat from the mud. Silas Thorne would often ride his black horse to the edge of the cliff, his face a mask of cold amusement, confident that the first high tide would simply carry Elara and her rusted toy to the bottom of the Missouri. But Elara was not just cleaning, she was investigating. As the water receded from the interior, she began to notice architectural anomalies that made no sense for a simple houseboat. The central hallway was 6 inches narrower than the exterior dimensions suggested. There was a discrepancy in the weight of the aft section that even the silt could not account for. One evening, while scraping the heavy layers of lead paint from a mahogany cabinet in the master stateroom, she felt a slight give in the wood. It wasn't a drawer, but a panel, held in place by a sophisticated spring lock that had been jammed by a single pebble of river gravel. With a surgeon's precision, she cleared the obstruction and pushed. A section of the wall swung inward on silent, greased hinges, revealing a hidden cabin no larger than a walk-in pantry. It was a sanctuary of dry air and preserved history. Inside, she found a desk bolted to the floor, and upon it sat a series of leather-bound ledgers, a brass sextant, and a massive, hand-drawn map of the Oakhaven Valley. This was the hidden sanctum of Thomas Miller, the town's founder and the original surveyor of the territory. As Elara opened the first ledger, her breath hitched. It was not a diary of personal thoughts, but a meticulous record of every land grant, every mineral right, and every water use agreement made in the valley's history. And there, tucked between the pages of the 1870 volume, was a document that chilled her blood, a map of the Vance Timber Mill property, clearly showing that the common lands used by the town for grazing and river access were not owned by any individual, but were held in a perpetual trust for the people of Ovenhaven. The conflict reached its boiling point in the heat of mid-July. The Gilded Willow was no longer a rusted shell, it had become a beacon of polished cypress and gleaming iron, its engine, a masterpiece of steam and gears that Elara had painstakingly rebuilt, now humming with a low, expectant thrum. Silas Thorne, realizing that Elara was not going to simply disappear, decided to force the issue. He arrived at the wharf with the local sheriff and a group of hired men, carrying a new ordinance that declared any unauthorized vessels in the dead reach to be a public health hazard subject to immediate impoundment and destruction. The townspeople gathered on the banks, a silent, fearful audience to the coming storm. Silas stood on the mudflat, his fine leather boots splattered with filth, and pointed a cane at Elara. "You've had your fun, Elara," he sneered, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "But the law has arrived. You will vacate this piece of junk, or we will drag you from it and burn the hull where it sits." Elara stood at the railing of the Willow, her father's heavy wrench tucked into her belt, her face calm and dignified. "This boat is a registered surveyor's vessel, Silas," she replied, her voice steady and ringing with authority. "Under the maritime laws of this territory, it is a sovereign space until its cargo is discharged. And I have quite a bit of cargo to deliver to the people of Oakhaven." Silas laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Cargo? You have silt and rusted iron. Sheriff, seize the girl." But as the sheriff stepped forward, Elara pulled the heavy steam whistle cord. The sound was deafening, a roar that shook the bluffs and signaled the Willow's rebirth. At that moment, a dozen local farmers and dockworkers, men who had been secretly helped by Elara with repairs and small shares of her father's remaining grain, stepped out from the tall grass, forming a human wall between the sheriff and the boat. Elara didn't wait for the violence to start. She ducked into the hidden cabin and emerged with the surveyor's map and the master deeds. She didn't hand them to the sheriff, she handed them to the town's oldest citizen, a woman named Martha who had been a girl when Thomas Miller first arrived. "Read the section on the River Trust, Martha," Elara said. "Read it loud so everyone can hear." As Martha's voice, thin but clear, began to recite the legal protections that Silas Thorne had spent years obscuring, the atmosphere in Oakhaven Bend shifted. The silence of the crowd was replaced by a low, angry murmur that grew into a roar of realization. Silas tried to snatch the papers, but the men of the town held him back, their faces no longer reflecting fear, but a cold, hard justice. The sheriff, seeing the tide of public opinion turn and recognizing the authenticity of the surveyor's seal, stepped away from Silas. He was a man who followed the letter of the law, and the letter was now firmly against the man who had bought him. The climax was not a battle of fists, but a dismantling of a lie. Elara invited the townspeople onto the deck of the Willow, showing them the hidden cabin and the ledgers that detailed exactly how Silas had manipulated the books to steal their land and her father's mill. The evidence was irrefutable. By the time the sun began to set over the Missouri, Silas Thorne was a man without a home, his wealth revealed to be nothing but a mountain of forged papers and stolen dreams. The karma that Benjamin Vance had always believed in had finally come full circle. Silas was not arrested, there were no cells in Oakhaven that could hold the weight of his shame, but he was stripped of his titles and his holdings. He left the town that night, a solitary figure walking into the dark, carrying nothing but the suitcase he had arrived with. The restoration of the community began the very next morning. Elara did not claim the mill for herself, she reopened it as a cooperative, using the heirloom seeds from the hidden cabin to provide a new, hardy crop for the farmers who had lost everything. The Gilded Willow remained in the reach, no longer a rusted outcast, but a floating library and town hall where the history of Oakhaven was kept safe from the greed of any one man. We look back now at the image of that 19-year-old girl, standing on the deck of a boat that everyone else had written off as scrap. Elara Vance had been homeless, cast out by the very people who should have protected her, and left with nothing but the lessons of the river and the memory of her father's hands. She had taken a $10 gamble on a rusted dream, and in doing so, she had found a hidden truth that restored 100 lives. The Gilded Willow was more than a houseboat, it was a vessel of resilience, a reminder that the things the world discards are often the very things that hold the most profound value. Elara's name became a legend in the valley, a symbol of the quiet strength that can move mountains if it is backed by the truth. She lived a long and dignified life, never leaving the river that had both taken and given so much. She understood, as we do now, that justice is rarely swift, but it is as inevitable as the flow of the Missouri toward the sea. The hidden cabin was never locked again, its records open to any who sought to know their history or claim their right to the land. Oakhaven Bend flourished, its common lands green and vibrant, its people no longer living in the shadow of debt, but in the light of a shared prosperity. And whenever a young soul felt lost or forgotten, they would go down to the river and look upon the willow, remembering the girl who saw a palace where others saw a wreck. We thank you for joining us in this journey back to the banks of the old Missouri, where the water tells the stories of those who refuse to be swept away. If you enjoyed the story of Elara Vance and her discovery, we invite you to share this video with someone who might need a reminder of their own hidden value. It is the support of listeners like you that allows us to keep these histories alive. Before we go, we want to leave you with one question to carry into your week: what is a time you found value in something others wrote off? We would love to hear your reflections in the comments below. Your stories are the heart of this community, and we read every one of them with gratitude. Until next time, stay close.